Welcome. Thank you for coming out to join us tonight. My name is Mark Cantrell, and I'm Associate Professor of English, Director of the Honors Program, and George Washington Scholar of Living Ethics here at Shepherd. And in addition to English courses, I teach philosophy courses, which is why I'm up here tonight. In addition to being sponsored by the Common Reading Program and the Shepherd University Foundation, Dr. Colleen Clemens' talk is also sponsored by the George Washington Institute of Living Ethics in efforts to foster discussions of key issues pertaining to ethics and ethical debates for people at Shepherd and in the surrounding communities. I'm going to explain briefly what the George Washington Institute of Living Ethics is and its mission. It's based in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and develops educational curricula and practices which apply American founders' wisdom, character, and values to today's issues and debates. The Institute develops on-site retreats, workshops, classes, and lectures on public, corporate, professional, environmental, and community ethics. Furthermore, it funds my position, the George Washington Scholar of Living Ethics at Shepherd. And I'd like to particularly thank Don Padoff, Ray Smock, and other members of the George Washington Institute of Living Ethics Executive and Advisory Boards for their support of ethics programming at Shepherd and events like this one. Right, now I'll turn things over to Shannon Holliday, who will tell you more about the place of tonight's talk in the Common Reading events this year and introduce our speaker, Dr. Colleen Clemens. Thank you very much for coming.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. Welcome. I'm Shannon Holliday. I coordinate the Common Reading program here at Shepherd. And as most of you know, hopefully this is a year-long program. We have events throughout the fall and spring semester. This year we're exploring Malala Yousafzai's book, I Am Malala. And so we're very excited for this event tonight. Thank you to Mark Cantrell and the George Washington Institute for their co-sponsorship. And also thank you to the Shepherd University Foundation who funds our program. So let's see. We are actually accepting nominations for next year's Common Reading. If you're interested, there is a space on the back of the program. The programs are outside and there's a survey on the back. There's a space there where you can recommend a book, nominate a book you think would make a good Common Reading for next year. But you can also email that information to me or call me in the office and share whatever you think might make a good choice. So we are accepting nominations now through the middle of next month. There's a sign-in sheet, which most of you students I know have signed. If you didn't, there is one outside. Please sign it and list your instructor if you'd like to receive credit for being here. We'll have refreshments afterward in the lobby, so please stick around for that. And once again, if you can complete the survey on the back of the program and just drop it in the box on the table as you leave, that would be really helpful. So we are joined tonight by Dr. Colleen Clemens, who is an assistant professor of non-Western literatures at Kutztown University in Pennsylvania. She holds a BS in secondary education from Pennsylvania State University, an MED in secondary education and English from DeSales University, and a PhD in English from Lehigh University. Her work focuses on post-colonial literature, feminist theory, popular culture, and issues of veiling in literature, and has been published in Feminist Formations and the Journal of Post-Colonial Writing. Please join me in welcoming Colleen Clemens.
Thank you both. Can you all hear me? Great. I took Malala everywhere with me this summer. The beach, coffee shops, doctor's offices, ballet class. The cover is hard to miss. Her bright pink scarf, her eyes looking right at the viewer. People comment on the book when they see it, as most people who follow the news at least know something of the young girl's story, the one you spent all summer with as well. I would like to start my talk with sharing two stories of interactions I had, both with really smart women who are readers and my friends. I am sitting in a coffee shop in my town when a friend runs into me. She sees Malala smiling up from my table. My friend begins to gush about how much she appreciated the book, having read it all in a few days. She felt grateful for how much she learned about Afghanistan from reading it. The second story begins at the kitchen table of one of my tutoring clients. The mother is hovering, nervous about her daughter's upcoming SAT test. The mother sees Malala and begins to remind her daughter, "Remember her? She was the girl in Afghanistan the Taliban shot." The daughter nodded her head, perhaps reframing her tutoring session and recognizing her privilege in the moment. So before I lose all credibility, and so the committee can stop panicking about inviting me here today, can somebody tell me what's wrong in those two stories? Right, exactly. Right, Pakistan, not Afghanistan. I am not telling you this story to disparage my friends. They are smart women who took the time to read the book your school has asked you to read. They are well-informed women who care deeply about women's issues around the world. And yet even they have been lulled by the narrative that I would like to deconstruct along with all of you today. That there is one essentialized version of the woman in the Muslim world, that all women from that region have the same experience, and that they are powerless without intercession of some element from the West. Once we have worked through this story of this woman, I will ask you to consider the ramifications of this essentialization, and consider how we can be allies to these women who admittedly need allies, while honoring their own stories and unique experiences. Many of you may never have heard of essentializing before, so let me try to unpack that idea a little bit for you. Very simply, an essential notion is an idea that generalizes and limits at the same time. It is the idea that there is an essence, a one-size-fits-all identity for a group. For example, when you hear someone say, "If women were rulers in the world, there would be no war," you are hearing essentialism at work. The idea behind this quote is that women are naturally not inclined to violence, that women are only soft and peaceful, and when they are not, there must be a reason to explain why they are going against those natural inclinations. Essentialist narratives are all around us, and one big part of the work you will do in your academic careers is unyoke yourselves from the powerful hold of essentialist narratives that hold us all in and have the power to make people feel abnormal or lesser. You will do the hard work of disrupting these narratives, as Nigerian author Chinua Achebe calls them, quote, "comforting myths," and work to create narratives that recognize diversity and the unique experience of yourselves and those around us in the world. Essentialism is the force that allows two very smart women who have spent considerable time thinking about Malala to conflate her with women in Afghanistan. Even though all of us in this room know Malala's story takes place in Pakistan, a country very, very different than Afghanistan. Do they share similar struggles? Yes. Does the United States have complicated relationships with both? Yes. Comparisons can be made, but conflation of nations and their peoples is a dangerous game. So what I'm asking you to do with me today is disrupt the essentialist narrative of the woman in the Muslim world. This talk will help us see how we got here by looking at two types of images that have overtaken our image of women from this region: the veiled woman and the phoenix, a term I give for the genre of memoirs like Malala's that show a young woman emerging from the destruction wrought by the hands of those Islamists that do not represent the majority of Muslims in this world. So how did we get here? And why does it matter? Scholar Edward Said argues in the original intro, because he wrote a different intro after 9/11, in the original intro to his seminal work, Orientalism, that without explaining Orientalism as a discourse, one cannot possibly understand the enormously systematic discipline by which European culture was able to manage and even produce the Orient politically, sociologically, militarily, ideologically, scientifically, and imaginatively. This lecture works towards Said's project of deconstructing Orientalist narratives in order to understand how the narrative of women in the Muslim world was constructed and its impact on those women today. It should be no surprise that the narrative that leads to Malala's memoir begins on September 11, 2001. So as Shannon said, I used to teach high school. And on that day, my second period honors English class, and I watched as planes flew into buildings. A room full of 17-year-olds implored me to make sense of what was happening on the screen, just as I had when I shepherded them through Hamlet's soliloquies and feminist readings of Jane Eyre. But I had nothing to offer them. That moment was too big for all of us. And I believe only now are we starting to make sense of it and our response as a nation to what would become the moment by which we would measure our lives. From that morning on, we lived in the post-9/11 world. And my research is one small piece of a larger body of work investigating this new world in which we live and the ways we speak about each other in it. After September 11th, a trajectory of anti-Islamic sentiment began. Starting with an overt othering of the Muslim faith, the U.S. government, under the purview of George W. Bush, worked to focus attention on the oppression of Islamic women, a progression meant to provide a rationale for eventual military action done in the name of the oppressed women, instead of the name of our interests. Suddenly, names that had never entered the national discourse on a broad scale became household words uttered with a mix of contempt and confusion. Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, Sunni, and Shia. Areas of the world previously known for oil or unrest within their own borders, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, housed an enemy who professed a hatred for all things Western, a hatred about which those outside of the academic or government circles knew very little. As Americans watched a new national department be created overnight, they began to speak about a world that, on September 10, 2001, may have been of little interest to them. An interest in the differences between the East and the West, I put quotes around those, grew nationwide as people found those foreign words slipping off their tongues. So I heed Said's warning against essentialist concepts such as the East and the West, and use those terms really loosely. I always joke that a post-colonialist best friend is air quotes, so you'll see me do this a lot, like East, West, natural. So I use those terms really loosely, recognizing that no clear boundary exists between these two concepts. He reminds us that we, quote, must insist that the terrible, reductive conflicts that herd people under falsely unifying rubrics like America or the West or Islam and invent collective identities for large numbers of individuals who are equally diverse and cannot remain as potent as they are. These are comments that he makes in the new preface that he wrote in 2003 after witnessing the September 11th attacks and their political aftermath. After the attacks, new images entered the living rooms of millions of Americans. Bearded men in white turbans sat in caves and laughed at the unanticipated success of the attacks of September 11th. And I know, how old were some of you? Some of you were what, 10? How old were you? 7, 6? Yeah. You know, it's really interesting to teach folks who have that kind of vague recollection. Up until that point, many viewers had never considered the global tensions between the East and the West, between nationalist movements and fundamentalist religious factions. September 11th forced the country's population out of its ignorance, as we witnessed on our soil a tragic manifestation of a problem that certainly was not new to much of the world. I witnessed a growing, rampant nationalism I had never seen before. Within days, reports of attacks against Muslims grew to higher numbers than even before in this country. Anyone who could be mistakenly construed as a Muslim based on traditional garb felt endangered, such as a Sikh man, Balbir Godi, who was shot 5 times outside his gas station because his attacker, Frank Roque, assumed Godi's turban meant he was a Muslim. Within the 6-day span after the attacks, the Council on American Islamic Relations received double the number of complaints about harassment than they had received during the entire year before. The Council estimated at that time 7 million Muslims lived in the United States. Though many of these millions of Muslims denounced the attacks, a fear of the other grew. Once Islam entered the U.S.'s national discourse, the veil became a powerful symbol of women's oppression under the Taliban and in the East. Images of veiled women ran on television, and many public officials evoked the image to rationalize what was then called the war against terror. Freeing women living, quote, under the veil became a rallying cry to justify invasions to change the ideology of nations. As former President Bush stated days after 9/11, quote, "This is the world's fight. This is civilization's fight. This is the fight of all who believe in progress and pluralism, tolerance, and freedom." The assumption here follows that women living in countries where veiling is practiced were not allowed freedom. Lorraine Ali, in her short essay written soon after the attacks, Not Ignorant, Not Helpless, eloquently summarizes the perception of Muslim women that she felt. She writes, "Muslim women are feeling like pawns in a political game. Jihadists portray them as ignorant lambs who need to be protected from outside forces, while the United States considers them helpless victims of a backward society to be saved through military intervention." In her speech for Thanksgiving 2001, so right after the attacks, Laura Bush, makes similar rhetorical gestures in her radio address that focused on women. She drew attention to the U.S.'s use of women's oppression to validate military action, thereby continuing to gender the ensuing conflicts. While her entire speech deserves close analysis, and it's on the White House's webpage, for the sake of time, I'm only going to offer a few excerpts to show this calculated use of the suffering of women to rationalize the recent declaration of the war on terror. So I'll read this quote and then talk a little bit about it. So this is the beginning of her speech. "I'm delivering this week's radio address to kick off a worldwide effort to focus on the brutality against women and children by the Al-Qaeda terrorist network and the regime it supports in Afghanistan, the Taliban. That regime is now in retreat across much of the country, and the people of Afghanistan, especially women, are rejoicing. Afghan women know, through hard experience, what the rest of the world is discovering. The brutal oppression of women is a central goal of the terrorists. Long before the current war began, the Taliban and its terrorist allies were making the lives of children and women in Afghanistan miserable. Only the terrorists and the Taliban forbid education to women. Only the terrorists and the Taliban threaten to pull out women's fingernails for wearing nail polish. The plight of women and children in Afghanistan is a matter of deliberate human cruelty, carried out by those who seek to intimidate and control." She then shifts to note that those in the Taliban are not civilized, alluding to the idea that it is the responsibility of those civilized to police those who cannot live civilly. They do not respect their women, whereas we in the West do. Not to want to preserve this respect is to be inhuman. So her speech, I cut some of it out, but this is continued. "Civilized people throughout the world are speaking out in horror, not only because our hearts break for the women and children in Afghanistan, but also because in Afghanistan we see the world the terrorists would like to impose on the rest of us. We respect our mothers, our sisters and daughters. Fighting brutality against women and children is not the expression of a specific culture. It is the acceptance of our common humanity, a commitment shared by people of goodwill on every continent. Because of our recent military gains in much of Afghanistan, women are no longer imprisoned in their homes. They can listen to music and teach their daughters without fear of punishment. Yet the terrorists who helped rule that country now plot and plan in many countries, and they must be stopped. The fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women." And finally, she ends her speech and reminds listeners of how lucky they are to be women in the United States. Only the United States can secure the safety of the helpless women around the world. In America, next week brings Thanksgiving. After the events of the last few months, we'll be holding our families even closer. And we will be especially thankful for all the blessings of American life. I hope Americans will join our family in working to ensure that dignity and opportunity will be secured for all the women and children of Afghanistan. Laura Bush focuses on the brutality the terrorists commit against women's bodies as if it were a new problem that just now the US would need to work on. Interestingly, up until the morning of 9/11, the feminist Majority Foundation's pleas to the White House for a discussion of women in Afghanistan had gone unheeded. In The Terror Dream, Susan Faludi reports that suddenly women's organizations were called to the White House to give briefings on an issue about which it cared very little before 9/11. The White House even held a conference on Afghan women, and eventually President Bush signed the Afghan Women and Children's Relief Act in December 2001 as part of his crusade. And those are his words. Suddenly, the women of Afghanistan were the locus of the US administration's interest, which waned once the war on terror began in earnest. By focusing on the violence done against the women, Laura Bush is setting up the opportunity to argue that one can only undo this violence with violence. Clearly, these people, if they torture their women, are incapable of being stopped without force. She invokes family life in the United States, recently shaken by the attack of September 11, 2001, and uses, quote, the blessings of life as the antithesis of women who are denied the right to care for their children. The women of Afghanistan, and not soon after the access of evil, including Iran, are denied their, quote, natural life of being mothers and wives. They can do nothing but rejoice at the coalition of the willing's efforts to liberate them from their state-imposed chains. I use these examples to show how, to Americans, the veil became a signifier that signified all the perceived negative aspects of Islamic cultures: patriarchy, lack of freedom of expression, tyranny, and fundamentalism. But one of the goals of this talk is to unpack that powerful signifier and show its complexity, its meanings shaped by nationalist state dictates, governmental laws, women's desires, and anti-nationalist movements. In her revolutionary essay, Under Western Eyes, Feminist Scholarship and Colonial Discourses, Chandra Talpade Mohanty discusses the ways the Academy uses and sometimes abuses the veil to discuss women in the Third World. She argues it is the analytical leap from the practice of veiling to an assertion of its general significance in controlling women that must be questioned. She notes that though the coverings may look similar, their disparate cultural meanings cannot be conflated. There is, in fact, no one essential veil, no singular meaning of what it means when a woman places a hijab, burqa, or any other covering on her body. Hence, when discussing this issue, I use the term veiling to dismantle the limiting idea that there is such a singular, essential identity as the veil, and to acknowledge the dynamic nature of this signifier. For Said succinctly reminds us in the preface that the worst aspect of this essentializing stuff is that human suffering in all its density and pain is spirited away. The focus on veiling and discussions of women in the Islamic world became the cornerstone of the construction of the essential notion of woman in those regions. In American popular culture, literature attempting to show Islamic oppression of women is de rigueur. A quick survey of the covers of some popular books will give us an idea of what image is used to sell such texts. So because I'm sure you could all use a tiny break, just talk with somebody next to you for a minute about some of the commonalities you see. So these are all the covers that I went through. This is your chance to stretch a little bit. Halfway through. I have to say, this is music to my ears. I love that. So when I discuss my observations, if I miss something you observed, please bring it up during the questions at the end of the talk. I would love to hear more ideas about these covers. I've been looking at them for a long time, and there are more to add at this point, but these are some of the more popular books. And one movie. I didn't put the movie on here, but I did in the slides. Here are some things I noticed. First, of course, is some use of veiling. But if we look more closely, we see that only one of the women depicted directly looks at the reader. Though Marjane Satrapi's main character's extra-diegetic gaze out from the center of her cover could perhaps indicate some semblance of agency, the assuming red cover overtakes her small figure. Her look of defiance is there, but small. And I do love that book. If you haven't read Persepolis, I highly recommend it. In fact, it would be a really good one to vote for next year. Oh, it was? Good job, Shepherd University. Bravo. Her look of defiance is there, but small. At a lecture to kick off One Book, One Philadelphia campaign, so Philadelphia picked this book as well to study, Satrapi admitted that she uses what she calls comics to distance herself from her story. And perhaps this is the reason we are allowed to see her look at us, but from a distance. The rest of the women on the covers look away. Some even don't have faces at all. In Kabul Beauty School, an American woman goes behind the veil, it says. In fact, what she does is go to Kabul to teach hairdressing. There is a sense from the title that she infiltrated some dark secret world where Americans never really want to go. The author of Reading Lolita in Tehran, Azar Nafisi, has even been criticized by fellow Iranian writers of going too far in her depiction of women in Iran and lofting an easy target to Republicans who wanted more fuel for their military fire. This is their criticism, not mine. She denounces any of these accusations, but she hasn't been able to shake the stigma branded on her by some of her fellow writers. In fact, I attended a conference session run by female Iranian writers, and many of them said her name with the disdain one might say for one's worst enemy. But even though her text shows women resisting an oppressive theocracy, the cover gives no inkling of such resistance. All of these women on these covers work toward creating this essentialist notion of the veil, as if all women in some kind of covering are all the same and need to be freed. Critic Mehdi Yeganoglu, in her book Colonial Fantasies, argues that studying how the West represents the veil teaches more about the construction of Western identity than that of the women who veil. She writes, "By taking the representation of the veil as a test case, I suggest that the presumption of a hidden essence and truth behind the veil is a means by which both the Western colonial and the masculine subject constitute their own identity. Moreover, by demonstrating the structural homology between the representations of the Orient, veil, and feminine, I suggest that the discourse of Orientalism is mapped powerfully onto the language of phallocentrism and thereby point to the inextricable link between representations of cultural and sexual difference. Western political action often relies on this mythical truth of the veil, that it is oppressive, demeaning, dangerous, and antithetical to the Western desire for freedom. The veil signifies all that is wrong with the Orient. Those in the West who are on a crusade, the language George Bush used when discussing the war on terror, often construct themselves as the savior of women. In The Terror Dream, Susan Faludi argues that Americans were also enlisted in a symbolic war at home, a war to repair and restore a national myth. If the myth of America is a place where women are safe and free, there must be another side to this binary, in which the women who live under the enemy must be covered and lacking in all freedoms. In these cases, the West uses the trope of the veil as a means of constantly replicating its belief in the dominance of its ideologies, specifically those of freedom and democracy. Yeganoglu concludes her introduction with a similar argument. As is up here, the desire to unveil women should not be seen simply as an uncovering of their bodies, but as a re-inscription. For the discourse of unveiling is no less incorporated in the existential or embodied being of Oriental women than the discourse of veiling. While in the West, the idea of unveiling is equated with freedom. And has anybody seen Girl Rising? At the end of that movie, they run up the hill and they tear off their burqas at the end. This idea of unveiling is equated with freedom. Yeganoglu urges caution in simplifying the act. The West has a vested interest in maintaining the idea that women who veil do it under duress and suffer greatly because of it, taking out any element of choice or desire to do that act. Thereby, in Western discourse, those who work to, quote, save the women will be, quote, greeted as liberators. In an interview with National Public Radio in February of 2002, then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld talked about the ways in which the U.S. in a short time was able to free the Afghani women of the burqa. Well, if you think about it, the United States, the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, those buildings were struck, what, 4 months ago? 5 months ago, almost to the day. Thousands of people were killed. Afghan was ruled by a terribly repressive government that was denying people their rights, killing people. Starvation was rampant. The country had been engaged in wars and conflicts for years and years, and the Al-Qaeda were recruiting, training, and financing and launching terrorist attacks around the world. 5 months later, the Taliban government is gone. There is a government that promises an election sometime in the next 6 months. That is representative of the various elements in that country. Women have stopped being repressed. They can actually walk out in the street and not have their entire faces and bodies covered by burqas. They can laugh on the street. They can go to a doctor, which they couldn't do. They can go to school, which they couldn't do. It is 2014. We all know that many of these victories were short-lived, and I am pretty sure women continue to be repressed. But of most importance to my argument is Rumsfeld using women's rights as a sign of improvement in a country, an issue, and a population about which his administration had very little interest months before. This notion of liberation, of freeing women, leads into my discussion of the second essentialist character, what I call the Phoenix narrative, a genre that of late has come to enjoy some success in the academic and public imagination. These are the stories of the young girls who have been beaten, tortured, oppressed at the hands of Islamists dedicated to misogyny and hatred, and who have risen out of the ashes of their suffering to find a new life. Before Malala, there was Mukhtar. Mukhtar Maya is also from Pakistan, where she lived without the same privileges that Malala had access to. Mukhtar's 2006 memoir, In the Name of Honor, tells of her desire to die after being gang raped as retribution for her younger brother flirting with a girl from another tribe. But instead, Mai comes to fight Pakistan's laws about rape and sues the government. Mukhtar's story would easily have been lost if it weren't for the attention paid to it and to her by New York Times journalist Nicholas Kristof, whom you may recognize from the bestseller Half the Sky. So I would like to show you a short video giving you an introduction to Mukhtar.
In Pakistan buigt het Hoge Rechtshof zich over een brute groepsverkrachting die tot internationale opschudding heeft geleid. De 36-jarige Mukhtar Amari werd op last van de dorpsraad verkracht door een groep mannen omdat haar broertje een relatie zou hebben gehad met een vrouw van een andere stam. Aanvankelijk kregen 6 mannen wegens de verkrachting de doodstraf, maar nu zijn 5 van hen alweer vrijgesproken. Amari eist dat alle mannen die haar hebben verkracht worden veroordeeld.
Mukhtar Amai komt uit het dorp Meerwala, ruim 500 kilometer van de hoofdstad Islamabad. Hier leven verschillende stammen nog volgens hun eigen wetten, soms zijn die bruut. In juni 2002 wordt Mukhtar aan haar huis uitgesleurd. Ze is zich van geen kwaad bewust. Volgens de dorpsraad van een andere stam moet ze boeten, omdat haar 12-jarige broertje een affaire heeft gehad met een vrouw van die stam. Ze wordt verkracht, keer op keer.
फिर उन्होंने मेरे साथ ज्यादती की पकड़िया वास्ते लेने रही अल्लाह वास्ते कुरान वास्ते कोई भी राह हो गए कहीं भेड़ दी 10-50 उन्होंने नहीं सुनी मेरा अब्बू भी था धर करेंदारी है मामू भी करेंदारी है कहने ना
Volgens Mukhtar moet de valse aanklacht verdoezelen dat haar broertje juist is misbruikt door mannen van die stam. Na haar herstel vecht Mukhtar terug en doorbreekt ze de cultuur van stilzwijgen en schaamte. Mukhtar groeit uit tot een symbool van de strijd tegen vrouwenonderdrukking in Pakistan. Mukhtar hoopt dat de volgende generaties anders omgaan met traditionele wetten. Ze heeft 2 scholen in haar dorp opgericht, om door middel van onderwijs het land langzaam te veranderen.
जब ये लड़के पढ़ते हैं लड़कियां पढ़ते हैं थोड़ा जो उनको भी शऊर होती लेकिन ये लड़के जब जवान से इंशाल्लाह मेरे ख्याल में हालात ठीक थी
Five years after what Mukhtar with some modesty calls the incident, the school is working and educating hundreds of girls. Girls who without Mukhtar's help would never have gone to school. Now the girls in this backward part of the Punjab can have expectations and dreams.
In the line of popular Phoenix narratives, next came Najud Ali's story. Married as a child, Najud escapes her arranged marriage in Yemen and finds her freedom by attaining a divorce at the age of 10. Again, here is a short clip giving you some background on Najud's life.
And this young girl is Najud Ali, who is Yemeni, and became at the age of 8 or 9, her age was never made entirely clear, she doesn't know it herself. She became the girl who busted open the subject of child marriage for the entire country of Yemen and internationally when 2 years ago she walked into a courthouse alone and said, I need a divorce. And The uproar that ensued, which was a marvelous uproar, she found herself a woman lawyer who had taken on the cases of abused women. Her case caused tremendous controversy all over Yemen, and ultimately a sympathetic judge granted her a divorce. I love this photograph so much. I've seen many pictures of Najud Ali, who did get a good bit of international attention over the years, but never one that conveys the joy that I saw in her when I talked to her after her divorce had been complete. She was the most astonishing blend of extremely wise young woman at the age of 11 and pure little girl. You know, let me sit in your lap and show you how to eat the Yemeni food. She will go on. She has co-authored, with the help, obviously, of an adult writer, a book that has sold internationally, and wants to go off and write for herself about the harms of child marriage and the importance of preventing it.
And as a side note, she's back in her father's house, and she's made claims that her father is keeping all the money from the book, and her sister is now married as well. So the story goes on with her. And the most recent of books that falls into this genre is, of course, Malala's story. I am working on the assumption that you have already spent some time learning and thinking about her. So I would like to move into the discussion of the three of these texts as part of the constructed image of women in the Muslim world. And if you haven't, I didn't put any clips in here because I assumed you'd seen some, but if you haven't, there's a lot of great clips online, especially when she addresses the UN. You notice a few patterns when you look at these three stories. Each one is mediated through a Western journalist that found the story of the young girl and wanted it to be heard. This element of assistance gives a clear indication that the audience for these texts is a Western audience. And of course the fact that the books are written in English or French originally. There is nothing inherently wrong with this being the audience. But I do want you to leave this talk considering why these Phoenix narratives have such a strong currency in the West. Do we leave the narratives feeling better about our own systems, our own treatment of women, our military engagements, often done in the name of women? Notice how the three covers use the same trope we have just talked about. But you were so engaged the last time, so maybe you could talk about those three covers and see if there's any differences, just for like 30 seconds. You were so good the last time. So it's like any commonalities you might see between these.
I love how you're always like accidentally.
Again, music to my ears. So this time maybe I'll ask, so what do you notice? What were some observations that you made? I heard you make a really good one.
I did?
Yes.
Help me out.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. So, well, I was noticing, I don't know which one, but I was noticing that Malala and Nurajad look almost identical.
That was the good observation
They
I
look
heard you.
exactly the same, so if you, like their skin is a little bit different, but I mean, everything other than the color of what they're wearing is almost identical. All three of their lips are almost the same, like their facial expressions are almost the same. And she said a really good thing too, I'm sorry I don't know your name, but she said that they all look like they know they're doing a good thing. It's like, so they're bringing their story, despite their shame, to say, you know, this happened and we're gonna be a voice for all the people who don't have a voice.
I like that you brought up shame too, right? Like, so there's, especially with Mai's book, In the Name of Honor, like that is the point of it, that she's so shamed by what has happened to her, that she's going out into the world to do that fight that you saw that brief clip of. Does anybody else want to offer anything? So some of the observations she made were the Malala and the Najud cover look very similar. All three look, you know, like they're rising up, that there's something about their look, that they're doing the right
Their
thing.
story is gonna help.
Yes.
You know,
There's an invitation.
Whoever's attention they can get, it's going to help them. Whether they've been a victim of the same type of thing or not, it's gonna help women in general, and that's their point and their goal.
Great. It's amazing what a cover can do. So right here we have the veiled woman that we just looked at. Thank you, by the way. That was good. But in a different way. These covers play on the imagery that over the past decade we in the West have become very familiar with, as I hope I have helped you see in the earlier parts of this talk. But in the case of the Phoenix narratives, we see the actual subject of the text. Also, the gaze is more direct. Mukhtar's cover may be seen as a bridge between the desire for the defeated woman trope, as we saw in the other book covers, and the emergence of these Phoenix narratives out of the Muslim world. So while her look is not direct, there is defiance in her face. And we see her face. The second two have the girls looking directly at the viewer, and I think that's what you were noticing. There's an invitation. There's something there. An invitation to work with the girls on the issue that they present to use in the books. Interestingly, all three of them, Mukhtar, Najud, and Malala, were named Women of the Year by Glamour magazine. Yes, exactly. Your chuckles are exactly why I'm talking about this. There is something disconcerting to me about a magazine dedicated to perpetuating the mythology of what a woman should be and using these women as their Women of the Year in 2005, 2008, and 2013, respectively. Again, I think that all of these women deserve to be honored for their work, and all three deserve to be heard. I have no interest in silencing women, but I am concerned about how the women and their stories of survival are being used for other purposes that perhaps conflict with their messages, such as putting Malala in front of a L'Oreal banner or using Mai to sell magazines. When their stories are used for other purposes, I bristle in concern for the girls and women themselves and hope that they are not being used in the same way the veiled women of the Muslim world, women of the Muslim world were used as objects of Orientalism, instead of being seen as agents of change in need of allies and partners instead of saviors. But these books do allow the Western reader some satisfaction. Consider why the story of Malala captured the world's attention. A smart, young, spunky girl who used her mind and her body to fight the most fearsome boogeyman in the U.S.'s collective imagination, the Taliban. But is this satisfaction really the end goal? Does Malala want us to be satisfied and applauding ourselves for not having the same problems? Or does Malala want action, not satisfaction? Is she looking for allies in her fight instead of creating a narrative that one may read and not even remember her country of origin? The final image I will leave you with is this mural by Texas artist Anat Ronan called Yes You Can, depicting Malala in the pose of Rosie the Riveter. When this image surfaced a few months ago, people were very excited to share it with me, knowing how much I appreciate Malala's story and the work she is doing. But this image concerned me more than pleased me for a few reasons. First, Rosie the Riveter was an amalgamation of women. There is no one exact person that was Rosie per se. Malala is a person, a young woman recovering from a devastating attack, exiled with her family from the country she loves. Secondly, I worry that we are asking too much of Malala. To be literally conflated with an icon of war is much to ask of an individual. For remember, the goal of this talk is to undo the essentialism that is reified by the Veil and Phoenix narratives that we have talked about for this past hour. Thirdly, Rosie the Riveter was tossed aside as soon as the war was over, and the country didn't need women to work in the factories anymore. I do not want to see the same thing done with Malala or her story, to be tossed aside when she and it are no longer serving this country's military or nationalistic needs. Perhaps it is good that Malala ends the main portion of her text this way, and this is the quote where I get the title from the talk, for the talk tonight. When people talk about the way I was shot and what happened, I think it's the story of Malala, a girl shot by the Taliban. I don't feel it's a story about me at all. Part of me cringes and feels great sadness for Malala's not identifying her own self with the narrative of her tragedy and recovery. However, then I see that this detachment of herself from her story may be the thing that saves her. For if we are asking too much of her narrative, then maybe she can preserve herself in the process if she loses control over the way her readers use her story. Thank you very much for your attention. And so now we have some time for questions and discussion. I know some of you have class at 6, so if anybody wants to scoot out now, feel free. Do you want me to do some? Okay. I'll give everybody a chance to leave that needs to leave. I was so excited when you made that So it seems like those who had to leave have left, so I'd love to chat a little bit with anybody that wanted to talk about or ask questions. Yeah.
I'd like to know how some of the students reacted to what you presented, what they think about the books.
So the question isn't for me, it's for the students. I love this. Very nice. I like that. What the students think, I would like to know that too. What the students think about some of the ideas. I think a lot of them left. I see this young woman in a green shirt like, please. But if there is a student that would like to talk about that, that would be great. And if not, I'll just take another question. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry, I couldn't hear it.
Well, she wanted to just know what you thought of that.
The discussion I thought was very on point. Like, I actually read I Am Malala this summer, so when it was happening, I was really young. I was only in kindergarten, but I do remember like talking about it as I was growing up, and it just made like, oh, America tried to help them. We did all these great things, and like reading the book, you got to see the ugly side of America, like what we actually did to them. We just basically said, oh, sorry for your crappy situation here.
I thought Malala did a really good job with her writer in that book of trying to show that, yeah.
And she like wasn't putting down America in any certain way. She was just stating what we did, and it like opened up my eyes to a lot of things like that. And also the whole thing with the veil and the burqa, and that's what we do think. Like when someone says, "Oh yeah, I'm Muslim," what do you think they're gonna look like? You don't think, "Oh, a woman in a dress or anything." You think, "Okay, a veiled lady or a guy with a towel on his head." Like that's unfortunately what we're programmed to think.
Well, and that's that narrative, right?
Yeah,
right?
and until I read this book, that's exactly what I thought. And everything, it just kind of changed my views.
So it disrupts that story a little bit. So you have that, we all do. Listen, I'm not like exempt from this. And it takes a lot of work to disrupt a narrative that is so embedded in a national story. Yeah, thank you. Were you able to hear her? Good, thank you. Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Just how do you balance? I mean, I think I understand what you're saying about Orientalism and Said and all that, and the tendency to other people. It's easy to demonize them, or the other side of that, of course, is to romanticize and sentimentalize them.
Yep.
So I think it's very hard to keep a balance between reasonable criticism and flipping the demonology from them to us, and recognizing the
actual problems,
the difficulty of maintaining that balance. I guess that's more of a comment than a question, but I'd love
Yeah,
to.
well, and that's something I talk about a lot with my students too, is how do you, so my short answer to that is interaction with texts like this, or interaction with people, actual people. And that's why I very much focus on the idea of being an ally as opposed to a savior. So how do we work with Malala? How do we enact what? How do we recognize that there are legitimate problems, right? There are legitimate problems that women in her country face without swinging to the other side, and or how do we be in the middle and recognize the problems without being on either side? It's something that I tell my students, like very honestly, I try to reconcile all the time. So for example, we were just talking about the Nigerian schoolgirls that had been kidnapped over the summer. We just did a very similar exercise with Africa, right? We wrote everything they think of when they think of Africa. And the list is all negative. So we talk about that narrative and how when those girls were kidnapped, emotionally, what I wanted was to just swoop in and get them back. But academically and politically, I understood that we needed to act like partners with Nigeria, right, with the country of origin. So I find myself doing that tension is very, very much a part of my work. And a part of what I try to get my students to understand is that there aren't easy answers. But to disrupt the narrative, like you had talked about, is a step in the direction of at least moving maybe over to the center without swinging to the other side. So if anybody did anybody see that big argument that Bill Maher had with Ben Affleck over the weekend, right? I mean, that was the tension of that conversation. Exactly what you're talking about. They just had that exact conversation, and it's constant, right? It's a constant tension, even inside of me. It's there. It's very much there in me too. Because sometimes I just want to swoop in. But how do I be, right? Feminists learn that, second wave feminists especially learned that pretty well when they kind of thought that they could impose a new set of what is right and liberatory, and people pushed back on that. So I think we learned from that as well. I saw a lot of hands just go up. Yeah.
But when you presented the Laura Bush segment about her radio address, it felt to me like you were looking at that from just one version, that she was somehow.
Well, I was looking at her rhetoric. I mean, I was looking at how her rhetoric
but
works.
But her stuff in rhetoric, I mean, I thought you framed that in a one-sided way, that she also had some real interest.
Well, sure. I mean, my argument is that there is a very much needed desire for that collective essentialist narrative to exist. I mean, that's what you're right. I mean, I am.
That wasn't her only narrative in that radio address. That's just what I.
No, that's most of it. I mean, that is most of her talk. I just couldn't have time.
You could look at that radio address in a different,
from
a different perspective too,
of
and
course.
not see it just as that being the only thing she was trying to say. I'm not saying it wasn't there.
Oh yeah, I think she's trying to say a lot of things, but for the purpose of this, I think the way she does it is part of a larger narrative that I was trying to show. Yeah, you're right. I'm making an argument.
I thought it was lines.
Okay. I can accept
And
that.
you're-
I mean,
you're asking us
that's
to-
fine.
you're
Yeah,
asking
no,
us to be stretched.
I'm
asking us to stress.
I'm accepting that and saying, yeah, I mean, I'm making an argument. I found her speech to be interesting, and I thought it was working in some of the other ways that's why I used so much of it. I had more of it in there, but I took some of it out because it's just long, and I felt like I was worried I was going to lose y'all. But yeah, I mean, I'm willing to accept. Yeah, it's part of my argument. Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
I like how you discuss the topic of the veil being the symbolism of oppression, because that reminds me of back in 2009, 2010 when France banned the veil, and how all these women came up and they said, you can't ban this, this is part of our identity. So even though we're seeing it as a sign of oppression, they're seeing it as a symbol of them and not the oppression being put on them.
So the way I started getting interested in this is I started writing about the book Snow by Orhan Pamuk, and he's a Turkish writer. And that's when I really started looking into the idea of the veil, or veiling, because I had this same idea of what the veil was. And when I started looking into Turkey, I saw because in the book there are all these girls who are fighting for the right to wear their veil, and they're killing themselves because they aren't allowed to. And that really disrupted for me, as a person, what I had thought. And so when I started studying Turkey, I saw this idea of women fighting for a desire within a secular state, just like the example you gave of France. That was a really big deal as well. That basically, for me, started all of this. What it did is it shook me and stretched me, right? It stretched me to think, wait a second, this is not always what I thought it was. So I'm glad you bring up France, because that's an ongoing issue in France still. And there are women who want to veil. And I think we forget that part of the story. There are many women who don't want to veil. I don't want to go away from that, right? There are many women who see it as a sign of oppression. Reading Lolita in Tehran is very clear about that. There's a lot of mention in there about freeing themselves when they get to the book club and taking off their veils, and only then can they be themselves. So I don't want to take away from the fact that there are women who don't want it, but it's much more complicated than we sometimes, we just need to be reminded, right? It's just more complicated sometimes. Yeah. Oh, he's been doing it forever. Yeah, but go ahead.
Oh, I just was crying off of her that I saw that convocation. I traveled to Istanbul this summer.
Yeah.
And I saw that convocation. My professor and I talked about how the women fought to have that cultural expression back of having the veil as their security, and it was their expression of their religion. And we see it as like an oppression, like, oh, you poor thing, you have to wear that. But it was something of their statement. They're like, this is what I believe in. This is my love. This is how I express how I feel. You express it in this way. And I fought to have this back. I expressed it in that way. And it was very interesting. It was very like fascinating to me to see that.
It's so interesting when you have those moments of contact, like women I've talked with who feel like, what I'm wearing is oppressive. Like being in the gaze, the male gaze is oppressive. And they feel like veiling actually is freeing to them to not be, or maybe not be in the male gaze. So that these conversations, right? That these moments of point, to go back to what you had asked, like just those moments of contact seem to help us disrupt some of these stories. Go ahead.
My question is about going back to the book covers. Because we looked at one set, but I'm looking at more of the Phoenix narrative book covers. Yeah. Was there anything about those book covers, because it seemed like those were maybe a step in the right direction, I guess is what we're talking about? Sure. I guess, was there anything that troubled you about them?
No.
Okay.
I like their gaze. I like the kind of confrontational look. I like the invitation. I like the recognition of the humanity. No, I mean, to me, those are exactly what you said. To me, especially the other two, they are invitations to be allies. Like they are like direct addresses to the reader to be invited in and to be allies, not saviors, like allies. And Malala, if you look at her website, there are all kinds of things that her foundation asks people to do.
I think all three of those too, they're like, when you say an invitation, to me it's like, their invitation is, don't feel sorry for my story, but recognize it, and what can you do to utilize it for the greater good?
Like there's agency.
Right.
They're faces, they're actual faces.
And I mean,
there's
somebody
agency.
that looks at those books that doesn't know their stories or doesn't have, you know, the introductions that you showed us, we may see it as troubling if we don't know the background, but taking a chance to get to know their stories, it clearly shows that it's inviting, you know, don't just feel sorry for me and look at it on the surface, or kind of like how you ended with, don't just take it for face value, you know, consider
how the story is going to be used. I mean, that's the part that I'm not necessarily troubled about, but I just want to be careful about, is how the narratives end up being used, which is why I thought that interesting detachment of Malala at the end from her own story. Do you want to say something?
Yeah. So I guess my question was, because when I looked at them, because I think the next slide that you showed was the L'Oreal one.
Yeah.
So,
I can go back to that.
So for me, I think a lot of the discourse sometimes with feminism, at least in our country, is with the photoshopping of women. And it seemed like those book covers kind of went to that Western standard of photoshopping too. So that's what troubled me, not the inviting look and stuff like that, was that photoshopping element.
Oh, that's a really good point. Yeah, I mean, that they probably are, right? They probably are. I hadn't even thought about that. So even though they're not like kind of, those covers aren't playing into a Western idea of like of beauty per se.
But they have to appease what.
But they have to still appeal. That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that at all. I mean, I just went right to this leap of how the stories, how these women, you know, are being kind of part of the group. Are you asking what his question was?
No.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I understand completely, because in our society, the way that we look at women and feminism and all that stuff, well, I mean, at least with magazines,
right?
I mean, women are portrayed in a certain way, and so are these women meant to be portrayed the same way? Are they photoshopped the same way?
On
Just
the
because
covers.
they don't have bikinis on or whatever, glamorous dresses, or I don't know. Am I anywhere near what you're saying, Tim? Kind of.
Yeah, I mean.
But I mean, photoshopping.
I don't think they're necessarily trying to sexualize them.
Right.
But when I've watched many interviews of Malala, and if you look at her book cover face versus like when she goes on the Jon Stewart and stuff like that, her face is very westernized.
You're right. That's a good point.
Mine just had to go back to that narrative that you're talking about, which I totally agree with you. And I think that a lot of times that we forget about them culturally too, because a lot of the, like, I guess, over in the Middle East, they're not part of our, like, the dominant culture that we see here. They're more collectivist, so they're more about the family, they're more about everybody else's interests but their own. And then I think that when we bring the issues to light here in the Western narrative that they talk about, that they try to bring up that, and in a sense, to me, I see it as like kind of like assimilation. They want them to be westernized. They want them to unveil themselves because we see it as oppression, but we forget culturally that for them, that it may not be that. So I think that goes along with the narrative. It's like looking at culturally how they are different too as well, and I think that we forget that all the time.
And it's easy to forget, right? I mean, I'm just here as a reminder, really. Right, yeah. Ultimately, it's not like it's just a reminder. And again, I live here. I have to remind myself of these things too. These are narratives about lots of different groups. It's not just this group. This is just the one I choose to think about. Yeah.
Another thing that I really liked about this was, as you were speaking, it reminded me of the work of Spivak.
Oh. Yeah. So if there's one, yeah. Go ahead.
And her concept
so
of white men saving brown women from brown men, that just came up like a big thing through the first half of this, and it felt good because I haven't gotten to utilize that much.
If there's one theorist that she was at Lehigh and I went and saw her speak last year, and like she might be to me the most important theorist of my own work. I don't cite her in this, but she's the underlying current of pretty much everything I do. So thank you for bringing her up in this talk. That was just delightful. Okay, so yeah.
I'm two kind of since I'm coming at this in my official role from the ethics perspective, like the issues that you raise a lot of ethical issues, and so I'm going to kind of comment and question.
Sure.
The first one has to do with how to ethically approach the stories of these individuals so that we serve as allies rather than saviors, right? And another that comes up is how to deal with the people on the oppressing end of their actual experiences and of our narrative of those experiences without surrendering to a kind of cultural relativism that seeds the ground from which we can take action.
The dance between moral absolutism and cultural relativism.
Right, and the need for action, and then trying to ethically justify that action while respecting cultural difference and the legitimacy of people when their views differ greatly from ours. Right? And the difficulty of trying to understand what is behind the thoughts of those who are perpetrating these actions that we see as absolutely cruel and unacceptable too. So how is, in the one hand, the first case, it seems like an ethics of collaboration and alliance, can help mitigate against that protective big brother, father kind of desire to swoop in and be the savior. Any ideas about how to negotiate the other one?
What's the other one?
The other one is a relationship with figures like the Taliban or like Al Qaeda or like the group that is whose name escapes me right now.
ISIS.
Well, the Nigerian.
Boko Haram.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there the possibility for common ground in those relationships, or at some point? And this is I don't know. This is not a rhetorical question at all.
Yeah.
At some point, does seeking common ground seed the ground from which you could act in a meaningful way to help the people who are being oppressed?
That's a fantastic question.
Tune in next semester for a talk on this.
I mean, seriously, wow.
I
mean, if I could answer that, the Nobel Committee was calling me on Saturday. But
I think it's
that's the constant, for me, that's the constant struggle, is where is that line? So it sounds like you kind of, that last thing you said about seeding ground, okay? Like, where is that line, right? Where is that line when terrible people walk onto a bus and shoot a 16-year-old girl on the face, right? So where is the line between finally just saying, this is it, right? How do we intercede? How do we be an ally with you? I mean, that's the problem. Part of the issue with Pakistan, right, is the complicated issue of them being our ally, but at the same time, these things happening. And I think the United States is trying to figure out that issue, right? And I'm trying to figure it out too. The best answer I can give is to listen to what Malala's saying and say what Malala wants. Because I'm not making decisions about militaristic actions. I mean, I vote, but I'm not making those big decisions. But I want that I mean, I obviously have that utopian desire for diplomacy to always work. I really do. But I am also reasonable and a global citizen, and I know that maybe that's not always the case. Like I talked about earlier with my tension about Boko Haram and the girls, right? I do have that tension inside of me.
It does seem to me like coming to understand these women's stories in their individual authenticity as much as we can, rather than having to fit them within self-serving stereotypes, might be a step towards being able to understand.
Always, right, as an individual, as a part of, instead of as part of like a bigger narrative, which is why I started with that story about both women thinking those women were girls were from, or Malala was from Afghanistan, right? Like, so somebody who had done all the work that you just said, right? All the work, read the book, knew the story, had done the time to sit with the authenticity of Malala, but yet still gets lulled into just saying she's from Afghanistan. Like that to me, when that happened twice, was what you were just talking about. So how powerful those narratives are, that somebody who did the work that you just said, it still wasn't enough to combat against falling into the trap of just saying she's from Afghanistan. Yeah.
When you read I Am Malala, this kind of speaks to the authenticity of her voice type of issue. You pointed out that that there was a kind of intercession on the part of the Western journalist or Western ghostwriter.
In all three, yeah.
And when you're reading, do you find that you can sort of tell when the ghostwriter is taking over and is sort of moving the way the woman is presenting herself, sort of becoming self-conscious of, okay, here's what Western readers
That's
want to
interesting. So
see
he's
or
asking if
something?
if I feel the presence of the ghostwriter, the mediated narrative. I don't. I didn't when I was reading Malala. I didn't feel like it was being steered that way, and I was actually really glad in the book that there were complications in the Swat Valley. I was really glad that they chose. I in my mind, I imagined that they sat down and like chose what to write about. But probably any story that's mediated is going to have that, of course. Yeah, I did. Did you sense it in there?
I felt like it was probably happening, but I wouldn't be able to.
But it wouldn't be able
pinpoint
to.
where.
Maybe one of the things that I would maybe say about that is the focus on the dad. I was really surprised about how much talk there was about her father, and then I understood why that was there, but I felt like maybe that might be the one thing that I would point to, that maybe they decided that there was a need to really tell the story of the work of the father, so we understood how Malala got to the place where she was. That I felt I see a lot. Like I feel like one thing about that story might be a lot of dad talk. A lot. Like I felt like almost sometimes Malala was being overshadowed in the book by the work of her father, even though the work of her father was very important. And it needed to happen for Malala to be in that place. But I was surprised by that. So maybe that could be something that they had talked about. Yeah.
I was thinking of a couple of different things, but when you just mentioned about the father, but doesn't it take an ally or someone to help make those changes?
For the father, or is the father
the
the
father
ally?
is speaking out on the benefit of young women to be educated. So on their own, they may not have a voice. So it takes someone else to provide that voice. But I was also thinking a little earlier, the example that we have to be careful that we don't get sucked in by extremists, as that is the model of women in the Middle East. Having lived there several times, and starting with when I was 9 years old living in Cairo, which was very westernized in the 50s. So it's very hard to see the difference between women in the Middle East living in large urban areas versus those that are in very small communities that are very tribal in their behavior.
Right, and that's the tension in the My piece, right? The tribal jirgas versus the national laws, and that's the tension for her in Pakistan. And when I show that video, I always bristle at the word backward. If the narrator uses the word, it's backward part of the country. But the tension between those two, especially in Pakistan, is so strong. And what I love about Malala's book is how she talks about that up until a certain point, it wasn't that. Like up until a certain point, like I love how she details very specifically the moment from which she saw this significant change and how quickly it happened in her world. I like that.
And the outside influence was having the significant impact. Partially,
I thought that was interesting that she
it's the
says that.
might makes right sort of situation that we've now said that we're in charge and this is the way it has to be.
That's definitely Malala's perspective, right? Like that she comes out and says that. So it's
we
an
were
interesting.
overrun and overtaken, and this is a consequence.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
In
I
terms
came
of the
over
voice
here.
of the narrator that was raised over here, I think you could tell it was an English rather than an American ghostwriter. I can't pick specifics, but when I was reading, I was picking up things that were things that aren't an American voice. That's all.
I just assumed that was Malala. know, with the, like a British experience of
No, my-
English as opposed to American. But you're right. I mean, it could be either. I hadn't thought of that. I guess they did a good enough job that I thought it was Malala.
And on a broader point, it may be obvious to everybody, but at the beginning when you set up this dichotomy of Orientalism and our view of the world, you have to remember in all wars that truth is the first casualty. And if you go back to World War I, the Germans were brutalized in the British propaganda because of their invasion of Belgium, and the rape of Belgian women was the battle cry to bring the British into the war. So it's not unique to this Western versus Eastern perspective. It's been going on. Yes.
That's why I thought this was such an interesting image, right? To take an image out of the world wars of World War II, and then
Did this author say that that was a reference there?
the artist.
This artist, sorry.
Yeah, because on the side, it quotes her. I don't know if you can see this.
No, I don't mean the reference to Malala. I mean the reference to Rosie the Riveter.
Yeah, yes you can. It's called Yes You Can, right? And that was always the line that was next to Rosie the Riveter. Yep. Oh yeah, yeah.
But
Oh,
out of
absolutely.
context, I wouldn't have made that leap.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Taking the title and the stance and everything. Yeah.
Color scheme.
Oh yeah. But the title, right? Yes You Can. So next to Rosie, it always said Yes You Can. So that's yeah.
All right, let's take one more question.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Is that you? No? Yeah. Yes.
I haven't read the book. I guess I probably will sometime, but she was, the photograph of her on the cover is
Yes.
quite glamorous. But
Yeah.
she was shot in the head.
Well, yeah. I mean
Has
that's
she recovered from that?
that's something I wanted. That's why I brought she. So they do detail in the book. They do show some of the pictures. So I think actually, isn't hair covering where it would be? But yeah, yes, she was shot there. So in the book, the pictures, and I have my book in my bag. You can see it. But the pictures show. But yeah, she was shot through the.
Right above the left eye.
Right. Yes. Yes. So that would be here, right?
No, that's
This side.
And it came out through her shoulder or something? So
Yeah, it was right under her collar.
So
I found it, it had taken a straight shot down.
it's a good point, but you would, if you look at the pictures, you do see that her facial structure looks different. Would you all agree with that? Like her facial structure looks very different than it does from the earlier pictures, for
I'm
sure.
saying that the comparison with the Arizona Congresswoman you was shot.
I didn't put a picture of her with Gabby Giffords, but they've been together. They have done.
But she
looks very different.
Yeah.
she's having real trouble recovering.
Yeah. They were different, and I can't remember how Malala describes it.
in the beginning of the book, or?
Yeah, you just gave a quiz on the first half, so you probably remember better than I do. But
I just remember in the beginning of the book, she was saying that, I mean, if you're talking about the experience, there was one man that was on one side of the bus and another man that came kind of in the back and asked her and her friends, blatantly, who is Malala?
Right.
And it makes sense now, you know, I heard what she said about where she was shot, or I read it, but I mean, it makes sense now that the guy was standing above her, so it makes sense to me that the bullet went
That was like down.
above, yeah, it went down, so that's, I was like, okay, it's
Because they
still
were
in
sitting
the
on the
eye and
bench,
out her,
right.
out her shoulder, but it does make sense that someone was towering over her, and her friends, I mean, the way that she described it was so real and so realistic for us, and that was understanding, whereas earlier I was gonna say, like, you know, her experience is not our experience. So that's what's good about this, is like it's giving her a voice of an experience that we don't know and we don't understand. So, I mean, that's what the book is, to try to get us to understand where she's coming from. But just the being shot herself, I mean, it makes sense when she described that somebody came onto a bus and he was standing up and they were sitting down. You know, the terror, and she talks about her best friend and how, you know, there was one and there was this, and she was in her friend's lap, and, you know, it happened really quickly, so I guess, I don't know, I'm kind of trying to go off of what he said, but the shot going down makes sense.
Great. And thank you very much.
Grab some refreshments if you'd like outside. There's a box to drop the surveys in on the table. Thank you for coming.